Summertime in Chicago. Mondo Bizarro. This is exciting. I really like CES. What's that down there? Come on, what are you waiting for?
So yeah, that's how Nintendo said hello to the world for the 1991 CES. The same event in which the public first glimpsed the beginnings of an intense rivalry, Nintendo versus Sony. And it all stemmed from trying to build a Super Nintendo CD drive. Here's a quick recap for you guys. Sony agreed to help Nintendo build a CD drive, which resulted in a new console, the Nintendo PlayStation. But they also went behind Nintendo's back to make sure only they benefited from the contract. Nintendo, realizing this, decided that instead of confronting Sony straight on, would then go behind Sony's back and make another deal with their biggest rival, Phillips. This ended badly. With now two separate machines being built, the tensions between the two were rising. But today though, we're going to look at the disaster created via the deal with Phillips and the impact it had on Nintendo's views towards CD-based gaming. Now, the deal between the two was that Phillips would create a Super Nintendo CD drive for the Nintendo and give them full licensing control, something the deal with Sony lacked. Phillips was also just about to release their first console, and in return Nintendo would let them use some of their most popular characters from some of their franchises. The console that this resulted in was the infamous Phillips CDI, which saw the light of day in 1991. And today when you think of it, you think failure, rubbish, a catastrophic mess, mainly due to those two, him, that guy, and these. Heck, they're really the only reason anyone really remembers this console. Without them, I expect it's highly likely that the Philips CDI would have faded into obscurity, like so many other consoles. I mean, who remembers the Hyperscan or the Loopy? You haven't got a clue about the Apple Pippin, nor I bet the Laser Active. And just how many of you know about the Zeebo? And that came out in just 2009, with a controller that looked like that. I'm not even sure how you use it. Yet, the Philips CDI is still remembered, so basically, the point is, without any of these guys, perhaps there's a treasure trove of forgotten brilliance hidden behind them. Such classics as the Wacky World of Miniature Golf, and Scotland Yard Interactive, and the Ultimate Noah's Ark. Well, it's not that bad. I mean, it's not the most gripping selection of games, but it's not that bad. Let's have a look at how they advertise. We'll be able to see the best of what they've got to offer. I'm sure they can sell us that way.
Say you're going to buy a CD player and you're thinking. But then you hear about the next generation CD player.
It's called CDI, and it works with your TV to bring you the ultimate in movies, games, and family entertainment.
Awesome!
Awesome is right. Awesome sound, awesome pictures, awesome choices.
CDI, tell a friend.
CDI kid, huh?
Now get into CDI, starting at $2.99 with $200 of free software.
Right? No. Forget it. Let's rip this thing apart. You didn't even try, Phillips. You didn't even try. And you had plenty of time to do so. You started this whole thing back in 1984. Okay, admittedly, the focus of the CDI was split in several directions. There was a big focus on music and film. However, games were definitely the biggest focus and selling point for most people. And because Philips started developing the software all the way back in 1984, they were in a really good position too. This was just when the video game market was beginning to recover. They saw the rise of Nintendo and Sega, giving them the perfect examples of what they should and shouldn't do, and how to go about it. So the decisions they made to appeal to that audience are completely baffling. For example, the design of the system itself. It was intended to be the next must-have revolutionary thing to own, better than all the competition. So what did they do?
How could they beat the stylish and simple designs of the two Super Nintendos, the coolness and the sleek look of the Mega Drive? What wondrous creation did they present to the world to stand above all others?
So yeah, their genius design was basically a big ugly black box that looked like every other 90s DVD and VHS player. But hey, don't worry, you don't like this design here? Well, that's fine, because there's a whole other 18 different versions of the console to choose from. And that's not even including the 8 more professional CDI consoles you could find. I'm not even joking. This here is some of the many different types. This isn't even all of them. As you can see, a lot of them look like variations on the big black box idea, but you could also get a lot of portable ones, a strange wall-mounted one, probably intended for places like hotels, one built into a speaker system, and another built in directly to the TV. There's really only one design that looks like it should have been a games console. This was created after they realised the system wasn't doing too great, so they really designed it as a budget, games-oriented version of the console, though it does look a tad like a barbecue to me. But they even messed this up. This one was aimed only at gamers, whereas the others did have stuff for everyone else. I mean, fair enough, it is a budget version of the console. But they decided it would be a great idea to remove the port for the second controller. So multiplayer games on the gaming version of the console were out of the question. Mind you, people had a hard enough time playing 2-player on the other consoles, mainly because they put the port for the second controller bizarrely on the back of the system. As for the games, platformers, RPGs and the standard kind of game you expect on something like the Super Nintendo or the Mega Drive were really not very common. Instead you got things like interactive self-help guides and reference books, or documentaries about history. A ton of games were electronic versions of popular board games and toys like Connect 4, and another big selection was game show games like Jeopardy! A major focus though, due to the technology, was full motion video games, more commonly known as FMVs. Basically games that played a video that would require you to normally click on things as it played to interact with it and continue the game and story. These were games like the excellent Dragon's Lair and Space Ace. There was even a couple of decent exclusives that were made for the console, such as Burn Cycle, but a few good games weren't really enough to sell it to consumers. For one, many of the few good games could be found on other systems like the Sega CD. And as for Burn Cycle itself, well, due to being one of the few better games, it actually escaped the sinking SSCDI and ported itself to the PC. Not that you'd ever want to play it, even if it was still on the CDI, because the controls would have been abysmal. And that was only if you could find the right controller. There was a ton of them to pick from, ranging from a mouse and keyboard to drawing tablets and trackballs. And even if you had the right game and the right controller, there was still no guarantee you could play, because certain controllers only worked on certain systems. So if your CDI couldn't use that controller, then you couldn't play. Out of all these different controllers, there was only a couple of actual video game ones. The first was based on the Super Nintendo one, and a later one similar to the Mega Drive was also released. The first one, this one here, had some odd features, like the ability to screw in a control stick. But hey, I know what you're thinking. Now, a proper video game controller is nice and all, but what would really sell me on this console is the ability to play with some of the worst controls ever conceived. Well, you're in luck. These 4 controllers here are the standard type of controller you're going to be using with your Phillips CDI. That's right, Phillips decided that this here was the future of the way we would play games. It was designed for use with one hand. The big disc in the middle was the D-pad, and the buttons around the outside were the controls, so you either had to stop moving to do any other actions or try and cram two hands around it. Combined with the terrible lag some games had, these controls were the equivalent to someone asking you to do your violin exam while also running the London Marathon and they throw rocks at your shins. I mean, it's possible, but it's not going to be fun and the results will not be pretty. Actually, the best way I could describe it is if you bought the latest hit PS3 game but was forced to play the entire thing using the DVD remote control. To be honest, the best you're going to get out of most of the Phillips CDI games is the interactivity of a DVD game. Hell, probably just a DVD menu. I mean, hey kids, throw out your Mega Man, we've got classic hit titles like Tic-Tac-Toe with all the playability of a styrofoam cup. What's that? You can play Tic-Tac-Toe for free already? But this is in electronic form, on the TV, which you can play for just the low price of $700. Right now though, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, this is all very good and whatnot, but what does this have to do with Nintendo versus Sony? Well, actually a ton more than you might expect. You see, this whole debacle happened during the SNES CD creation, and it severely affected Nintendo's view on CD-based gaming. In fact, for a while, they didn't even bother with Sony at all because of it, just letting them get on with whatever they were doing, but offering no longer any assistance. It's understandable as to why their view of CDs became so tainted. I mean, look at the examples they'd seen so far. Their Famicom disk system was often breaking down to the point where they decided to not release it in the West. Sony, who had tried to convince them that CD-based gaming was the way to go, had proven themselves untrustworthy. Their biggest rival Sega was facing increasing issues with their own CD-based console, and Phillips, the only people they had partnered with, had created a flop. And as for believing in Sony again, well, they'd partnered with their biggest rival, a group who creates similar technology with similar ideas. If technology giant Phillips couldn't get results, why should they believe Sony could? Combined with the fact that CD-based gaming meant less space on the disc than a cartridge with longer loading times, is it any surprise that Nintendo came to distrust discs to the point where they didn't use them till the GameCube era? Even then, you could still see the remains of this distrust. The GameCube used special mini-discs so that Nintendo still had a bit more control over them. As for what Sony was up to during all of this, well, they went off and tried reimagining their console, now realising Nintendo wasn't willing to assist them. A few months after the CES incident, Sony revealed the PlayStation again at Tokyo International Electronics Show in October 1991. This time, it was portrayed as a gaming and educational console, with most of the presentation focusing on educational multimedia games. Gosh, doesn't that sound familiar? No games were actually shown since they were still trying to sign deals with publishers, but it was still able to play Super Nintendo games, and they aimed for a launch date of summer 1992, deliberately 6 months before the proposed release of the Philips Super Nintendo CD drive. This resulted in Nintendo announcing in January 1992 that they were abandoning their partnership with Sony, so bye bye Super Nintendo games on the PlayStation. Sony's response to this? Well, remember Sega? They had stayed out of this as much as possible, focusing on the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo rivalry instead. Sony was having none of this, and so in CES 1992 decided to tell everyone that they planned to make CD games for the Sega CD that had just been launched the previous Christmas, just to get back at Nintendo. At the same CES, Phillips announced that it still planned to work with Nintendo and that their Super Nintendo CD drive will be out by Christmas, though it would be pushed back to 1993 later in the year. Nintendo confirmed Phillips' statement, and at this time even mentioned how they had full licensing control over the system, quite proudly. However, they were already becoming very dubious over the CDI, seeing most, if not all, the problems with it. Deciding that they didn't want to personally make games for the system, they compromised, and gave Phillips the right to their characters, but stated they had to make the games. And thus it resulted in the infamous Zelda and Mario Cdi games. Let's take a quick peek at them, shall we?
So, let's start off with the most famous of the CDI games, The Legend of Zelda The Wonder Gamelan and The Faces of Evil. Even if you've never played a Zelda game, chances are if you've been on YouTube, you've seen clips from these two. As previously stated, Nintendo played no part in their development, but oddly enough, Phillips didn't develop the games either. Instead, they were given to a small independent studio called Animation Magic, and it was simply funded by Phillips. Phillips made another baffling decision though. After they demanded the games use FMVs, high resolution graphics and CD quality music to show off the CDI to the best of its abilities, they then decided to give them a rather tiny budget of about £600,000, and then they had to split it between the two games. They were also given a single year to make them. That being said, Animation Magic didn't spend incredibly wisely, deciding to fly in 4 animators all the way from Russia to make the now famous cutscenes. Now today, the most common reaction to these games is a rage-filled BLARG! However, back then, it was a very different view of the games. They supposedly wowed the audiences at CES 1993 for its stunning animation and graphics. That's right, these things here.
Breathtaking! Brilliant! Perfect animation! A reasonably good game.
Okay, so it wasn't all high praise.
You've got to be kidding.
Now, let's move on to Zelda's Adventure. This Zelda CDI game is quite different to the other two, mainly because Phillips gave it to a different company, this time called Viridis, and because, unlike the side-scrolling style of the Animation Magic games, this was a more traditional top-down view Zelda. And quite a lot of effort was put into this, which is why its tale is kinda tragic. First of all, they got some live action cutscenes, and used real life photos for the background to add some realism, including helicopter shots of Santa Monica Boulevard and Hawaii, and even some holiday snaps from the developers. While this looked nice, this unfortunately took up all the RAM, something that caused a lot of arguments within the team, fighting over mere kilobytes of the stuff. Despite this, they still wanted to make the game look great, even making miniature models for every interior to keep the realistic look. They honestly really did have high hopes, even claiming early on that they hoped for 300 hours of content, but as development progressed and the game got more and more weighed down by the CDI's limitations, they ended up with only about 12 hours and got stuck in testing for a whole 2 years just to make it playable. That was longer than it took to make the game. The game ended up with overwhelmingly negative reviews for its intensely digitized graphics, terrible acting, and the inability to produce sound effects and music at the same time.
There will be no more viewing tonight.
So, Hotel Mario. Unlike the other games, this one was actually made by Phillips themselves, in their own development studio called Funhouse Factory. And unlike the adventurous Zelda games, this one was a puzzle game. Unfortunately, there really isn't much information on the game's development. We know the hotels were redesigned at one point because they were dull and lifeless before, but other than that, it's a complete mystery. The game also got terrible reviews, some pointing out how odd it was to base your entire gameplay around opening and closing doors.
That ought to do it!
That's right, there's a forgotten Mario CDI game, one which actually sounded like it was going to be, are you ready for it? Good. The only problem is that it was never released. Now, Super Mario's Wacky Worlds was intended to be a direct sequel to Super Mario World, and was created by a small company called Nova Logic, after the suggestion by a Nintendo executive to boost CDI sales by porting the simpler Super Nintendo games to the console. This resulted in the idea of making a sequel. Excited by the idea, Nova Logic worked for 24 hours a day for 2 weeks preparing a single level to show off to Nintendo, getting it ported to CD just in time with only 4 hours to spare. And they actually managed to greatly impress Nintendo. But despite this, the project was destined to fail. Although the praise from the big N, Nintendo had lost all faith in the CDI and cancelled the project, though the lead designers did expect this to happen. Upon its final version before cancellation, around 80% of the art, 95% of the design, and 30% of the code was complete. And you can even get a pre-alpha download of it online. Though bear in mind it is a pre-alpha version, it's not exactly complete and not exactly very playable. Well, that is all for this episode, but stay tuned, because while these gaming empires have been divided, they are destined to meet one final time before changing the gaming industry forever, in a showdown between Nintendo and Sony that's effects ripple through the gaming world to this day. Stay tuned, I promise you it's coming soon. Hey guys, thanks for watching. I know this video has been a long time coming, but I'm back. I'm in a new digs. I'm off at university and I've got a ton of new ideas. And I want to thank all you guys that have been sticking with me. A lot of changes have been happening in my life and helped me pass the 5,000 subscriber count. You have no idea how much that means to me. I'll see you all soon with tons more videos. I'm back, guys. See you soon.